Hi class, we're back for part 2 of chapter 6, intervention, or assessment and intervention principles. And I said at the end of last video in the book, we would be jumping ahead now to page 184. And in doing so, we are going to hit point 3 of the assessment process. And point 3 is interpreting the assessment findings. We're going to talk about 3 different things that happen as we're interpreting these findings. The first is landing on a diagnosis. Now, diagnosis is a very medical term, and if you're working in hospitals or clinics or private practice, that is the term you're going to use, and it's the term I'm going to use now as we're talking. But I just want you to know, in public schools, although we are doing the same assessment process, and truly we are diagnosticians, we just don't use that medical term. We would use the term identifying a handicapping condition or identifying the area of disability for qualification for services. But we're doing the same exact assessment, hopefully. So I'm going to go back to using the word diagnosis. I just want you to know you may not hear that term used in public schools. The next little phrase that I'm going to use is one of my absolute favorite phrases in talking about assessment because it's so significant, and it's the word preponderance. So let me read the sentence. We make a diagnosis based on a preponderance of evidence from a variety of tools and techniques. Preponderance means a whole lot. We have the awesome, not awesome like, wow, this is awesome and great, awesome like this is very serious. We have the awesome responsibility as diagnosticians of identifying a person as having a disability. And we don't take that responsibility lightly. So when we arrive at a diagnosis, it better be because we have a preponderance of evidence to support that diagnosis. And we're going to get that from a variety of tools and techniques. We talked about those in our last video. We could use instrumentation, we could use formal testing, we can use rating scales and questionnaires and observations, and we should use as much of that as possible to arrive at this diagnosis, which we are basing on that preponderance of evidence. Okay? Diagnosis, it means that this assessment shows that there's a particular aspect of communication that is markedly discrepant from what's observed in the typical population, or that it is markedly different from what's expected in this individual. So we need to know the individual's background, right? We need to know what their level of development is up until this point. We need to know if there's any other primary disability that impacts communication before we begin assessing them, because what we're looking for is how is their communication different than it was previously, or how is it different from what we would expect for someone this age. In order to make a diagnosis, it must also have some adverse effect on the person's functional activities, either in their home or at school or in the community. Before we call this disabling, there has to be some functional weakness in communication. So that's diagnosis. The next is related. It's differential diagnosis. Differential diagnosis is the process of systematically differentiating a disorder from other possible alternatives so that we arrive at an accurate diagnosis. So, for example, a person who's presenting with some language weaknesses. Is this because they have short-term memory or working memory problems, or is it truly a language disorder? A person who is awkward in social situations, can't follow a conversation, attend to social cues. Is this mild autism, or is it ADD or ADHD? They look very much alike, and we need to arrive at the correct differential diagnosis instead of just jumping to a single diagnosis. So that's differential diagnosis. We talked about that a bit. I'm sorry to go back, but we talked about this in the chapter on motor speech disorders. We need to make a differential diagnosis between things like apraxia and dysarthria because our treatment is going to be different. Okay, the third piece of this is severity and prognosis. And we've already talked about that in previous chapters, the ranking of severity as mild, moderate, severe, profound, um, and then the discussion of prognosis. In this case, it's prognosis not like we think of prognosis with medical diagnoses, but prognosis like is this a lifelong disorder that we can help alleviate with accommodations and modifications and some other direct interventions, or is this a simple speech disorder that give us a year's worth of therapy a couple times a week and we can completely resolve? Those are the kind of prognosis we're talking about when we're doing this kind of assessment. All right, the fourth piece of this assessment process is the developing of an intervention plan. And this is based on the person's strengths and needs that we've identified through the assessment process. So, developing this plan also has three pieces. The first is identifying treatment goals. So, or coming up with treatment goals for this client. Goals have to meet three requirements themselves. They have to be functional, measurable, and attainable. So, let me see if I can quickly tell you what those mean. A functional goal is one that's going to quickly help this person's communication be more effective. So, for example, if I have a 4-year-old in front of me who's only communicating in single words, I'm not going to write a goal like he'll be able to name his colors. I don't really care if he can name his colors. Of course, someday I want him to be able to name his colors because that's a pre-academic goal. But right now, I want him to get his needs met. I want him to be able to use 2-word phrases or 3-word phrases, to be able to comment on his environment, to be able to ask a question. So my goals are to help make his communication more functional for his home situation or his participation in a preschool classroom in terms of getting his needs met. Okay, that's functional. Doesn't mean I would never write a color goal, but I'll tell you, I don't write them very often. The goal also must be measurable. So here's a goal that's really not measurable. The child will learn 10 new vocabulary words every month for the next 6-month period. Why isn't that goal measurable? I can count to 10, right? It's not measurable because I don't know what exact words that child already knows and uses. There's no way I can measure all of that in my assessment. So how do I know if these are 10 new words for this child? Not measurable. Here's a way to write a vocabulary goal so it's measurable. For every thematic unit presented to the child will demonstrate understanding of and use of 10 vocabulary words from that unit. Okay, so let's talk about themed vocabulary units. Any SLP that works in public schools that you talk to will tell you that October, November, and December are the best therapy months. There is just such rich vocabulary that kids are automatically interested in, right? We're talking about Halloween, we're talking about fall. It's really fun because we talk about colors and we talk about hay rides and apple cider, even though we live in Southern California where none of that happens. The kids still love it. We're talking about Thanksgiving. We're talking about cooking and baking. We're talking about Christmas and Hanukkah and piñatas. It's just there's so much therapy to vocabulary to pull from, right? Now notice I never said we're going to learn 10 new words. This child's going to demonstrate understanding of and use of 10 words related to a thematic unit. Every thematic unit, every month, I'm probably going to present 20 words that I think this child may or may not be familiar with. Out of those 20, they're probably going to learn 10 of them really well. And I'm going to pre and post test that list of 20 words to see which ones they already know and then to see which ones they've learned by the end of the month. And I'm going to plan all my therapy to include all of that vocabulary. That's measurable. And then the word attainable. Goals have to be functional, measurable, and attainable. It has to be reasonable. I am not going to let's say I'm back with my 4-year-old that's only speaking in single words. I'm not going to say that by this time next year he'll participate in a conversational exchange of 2 or 3 exchanges. That's not reasonable. Um, Conversational exchange implies that the person is speaking in sentences. Um, and that's not an attainable goal for this child. An attainable goal would be by this time next year, the child will use 2 to 3 word phrases to comment on something he's doing or something in his environment. The child will use 2 to 3 word phrases to request a needed item to complete an activity. Those are attainable. They're also measurable, but they're attainable for where we know this child was to what kind of progress we can expect. By the way, you never expect more than a year's growth in a year's time. That's all we expect of kids without disabilities. Why would we expect a child with a disability to have faster growth than that? All right, the fifth part of this assessment progress is that progress monitoring and monitoring of outcomes. So, assessment is not just a one time thing, it is ongoing so that we can measure progress to accurately document and modify treatment as needed and to determine an appropriate time to discharge. Excuse me. We might also bring that client back in like 3 months post discharge and do some other progress monitoring assessment to make sure that there's continued self improvement or that they've maintained at least the skills they left with. Okay, talking through a mask, which I did most of the day today because there were a lot of us in the office, it makes your throat so dry. I'm sure you're all aware of that. I'm going to show you my mug. I've never shown you my mug before. One of my parents, a parent of one of my clients, gave me this years ago, and I love this mug. And by the way, it's whom. Then on the other side, which you never get to see because I don't hold it this way, nerd. I prefer the term intellectual badass. I love this mug, but I don't take it to work with me. Except here, because you're grown-ups. Okay, categorization of assessment instruments. We're in your book now back to page 178. So the types of assessments we may use. We're going to talk about 5 types of assessment. The book only describes 4 of them. So here's one of those times where I'm going to give you information that is not in your book. It used to be, and in the updated edition, the authors opted to leave one of them out, and I don't get to have a conversation with her, so I'm not sure why she left it out, but I still think it's important, so we're putting it back in. The first kind of assessment is a norm-referenced assessment. Norm, N-O-R-M. It is short for normative, and we'll talk about that word again in a minute. Norm-referenced. This type of assessment compares an individual's performance to that of his or her same-aged peers. And there are 4 qualities of a norm-referenced assessment that you need to understand, 4 features. The first is the term standardization, which I told you earlier we would come back to, and here we are. Standardization means that this test must be given in a uniform and scripted manner to everyone who takes it. So everyone who takes it hears the same script. They're given the same instructions and they hear the same script. So I'll give you an example. The Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test is a test of single word receptive vocabulary. So there are 4 pictures on the page. And you have a client across from you and you say, look at these pictures. Point to boat. Flip the page. Point to climbing. You don't say point to the boat, point to a boat. You don't say point to the person who's climbing. You don't say point to a man climbing. You stick to the script. Point to. You can say show me, but otherwise it's point to. And you must give it that way. Believe it or not, adding an article like the or a, adding another word is a hint. Standardization means everyone hears it the same way. Nobody gets a hint. Okay, the next quality of a norm reference test is normative sample. It's based on a normative sample. This is the group of individuals who are given the test to identify what the standards of performance are for each specific age level. So as the test is being developed in its research phase, it's spread out across the country, and people are collecting data and sending it back to the developers of the test. And that data is then gathered to create this normative sample. So here's the data from all the 4-year-old boys, here's the data from all the 10-year-old little girls, and we develop the normative information. So a normative sample, the group of individuals given the test as it was developed. So you're asking, before you even begin giving this test, does my client compare to the normative sample? So are there any children in this normative sample for whom English is not their primary language? If there's not, you're not given that test. Are there any children in this normative sample who are intellectually impaired? If there's not, you're not giving this test. Your client has to compare to the normative sample. Are there any children in this sample for whom African American dialect is used in the home? If there's not, and this is a test of English syntax and word order, you need to be very cautious in using this test. So we need to look at what the normative sample is. The third quality is the use of standard scores. Now, by the way, all of you have taken norm reference tests. If you've participated in the SATs, the PSATs, the state testing that happened when you were going through school, those are all norm referenced standardized tests, and they generated standard scores. For those of you who've already taken statistics, you should be familiar with most of these. The first one, though, is the raw score, and that's just how many items the client gets right, or in some cases, how many they get wrong, depending on how the test is set up, the raw score. The next term under standard scores is the standard normal distribution. So there's a little chart for that in your book on page 180. It is the mathematical model, so basically the BEL, right? The mathematical model of probability regarding distribution of scores. Another standard score term you need to know is the mean. The mean is the average score, and in a standard normal distribution, the mean is always 100. Okay, it's that very middle score, 100. The standard deviation is the spread of scores on that normal distribution away from the mean, outward from the mean. Standard deviation is usually 15 points. So one standard deviation would be 115 points above, or 85 points. So between 85 and 115 is one standard deviation away from the mean. Percentile rank is the percentage of people in a normative sample group whose scores were at or below a given point. This is the score that I most often discuss with parents because it's easy to understand. This is if I line up 100 children that are exactly the same age as your child, and number 1 in line performed the poorest on this test, and number 100 performed the absolute best on this test, where does your child's performance fit in that line? That's the percentile rank. So those are the five points of standard scores: raw score, normal distribution, mean, standard deviation, and percentile rank. The next discussion point under types of assessment is, does this test have diagnostic accuracy? So we're under norm referenced. Does it have diagnostic accuracy? How well does this instrument reveal an accurate diagnosis? And I think I've said this once previously. I hope I am not remembering that incorrectly. But if we're talking about a single test instrument, it does not usually very well reveal an accurate diagnosis. We don't ever make our judgment of diagnosis based on a single instrument, right? We need a preponderance of evidence over a variety of instruments, and that's because one test is usually not diagnostic. If I give a child the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, for example, all I know is a little bit about their single word receptive vocabulary. I don't know that they have a language disability. They may not have been exposed to good vocabulary. If I give a test of language processing that doesn't involve a lot of visual information in the test, I still might not know if this child has a language problem because they may have some other issue with auditory memory that's impacting their performance. So we need to look for each instrument we choose. How accurate it is at helping us make a diagnosis, but it's also why we never choose just one instrument. Okay, so we talked about norm referenced testing. The next is criterion referenced assessment. This is the individual's performance being judged against a particular standard of performance. And we've talked about this a little bit before. A hearing test, for example, is a criterion referenced assessment. We don't look at a person's hearing and say how well do they hear when compared to someone their age. We say how well do they hear compared to this criterion that we've determined is what is normal hearing levels. So hearing testing is criterion referenced. There are criterion referenced speech and language assessments too. I don't find them particularly useful for diagnostic purposes. I find them useful for progress monitoring, but they are part of an assessment protocol. Moving on to performance-based assessment. And this is the one that is no longer included in your book, but I think it is significantly important enough to talk about. Another name for it is authentic assessment because it describes skills or behaviors within authentic contexts of use. Communication is highly influenced by context. The syntax we use, the vocabulary we might choose to use is influenced by context. And so it's important that we are considering, at least, if not including, different contexts when we're looking at an assessment. So for example, if I were going to assess your speech and language abilities, and I wanted to know if you had acquired sufficient skill with academic language and professional kind of level communication abilities. But the only assessment I did with you was to go out and do an observation while you were in a group setting with your peers. Let's say you're all sitting out in the quad. Wouldn't that be nice if we could all go out and do that again? You're all sitting out in the quad having lunch or in between classes, or you're all sitting in a club across the street listening to music and having conversation. And that's where I choose to assess your language competence for academic and professional language. You can see you and I would both be in big trouble here. I would not be getting accurate information, and I would probably be judging your language as less than adequate for what I'm measuring. Context is important. So when I'm doing an assessment of a child, I want to assess their language skills on the playground with their peers, in the classroom during instruction, in my office in formal testing. So we want to look at authentic contexts of assessment. That's performance-based assessment. And then the fourth piece is dynamic assessment, the fourth type of assessment. This is actually my favorite. It's what can this individual do with varying levels of support? And it's based on Vygotsky's learning potential. So Vygotsky, let me spell that for you. Vygotsky, Vygotsky's learning potential. If you've taken Psych 101 or abnormal psychology or educational psychology, I'm sure you've heard of Vygotsky at this point. Vygotsky's learning potential, his theories of learning, which we'll talk about again later, um, are asking the question, how much can an individual achieve with a little bit of assistance from another person? You cannot document learning principle or learning potential, without considering how an individual performs with just a little bit of assistance. So I'm going to go back to that script I gave you for the synonyms subtest. The one where I'm going to say a word, then I'm going to say four more and say the word again. There is no visuals for that test at all. No written words. They just have to hear you say those words. I give it in the scripted manner, and that is how I score it. But I will often go back if they've done poorly on it and give it again. And this time I either give them the first word in written form or I give them all of the words in written form. Because what I want to know from that test is, does this person have the concept of synonyms? Do they understand synonyms? And I know that many of my students that I test have difficulty with short term or working memory. And so they do poorly on that test because they can't remember the words that I said. If I can go, I still have to score it that way because that's how it was standardized. But if I can go back and say, it's not a problem with synonyms, it's a problem with memory, I know I can give them now a different test to kind of null out where the actual language weakness is. So I'm going to give them that one using dynamic assessment. Now I'm going to put that in my report because it's good information and because it makes my administration of the test valid because I've now reported on that. But dynamic assessment, what can the individual do when we give them a little support? That's also super important information for both teachers and parents and caregivers. The fifth kind of assessment is progress monitoring assessment. And this looks at progress during a course of intervention and compares actual rate of growth to what the expected rate of growth is. This allows us to now adjust our interventions. If the person is not making the progress that we anticipated, we need to make some adjustment, either give them additional time, change the goals, change our procedures. If the person is making more progress than we anticipated, we need to think about rewriting goals or decreasing the amount of time we're pulling them in for intervention. So progress monitoring. We're going to stop right there. And I can't think yet if we'll have a part 3 video or if we'll do this rest in class. But you'll see when you see the slide at the end.